So in this video, we're going to go over a simple app that's going to take in the dimensions of a rectangle and spit out the area. This gives us a really simple opportunity to talk about, getting input from the user, returning output, dealing with invalid input and invalid numbers and exceptions, and how to work with that. That's going to translate into lots of other more complicated apps that we can build throughout the semester. So that's kind of where we're going through here today. Just for some context, the way that we calculate that area is we take the width of the rectangle, as you can see is usually labeled horizontal, the height of the rectangle, multiply those two together, and that gives us the area. So that's the basic formula in terms of the math that you need to understand. Now let's dive into the actual implementation. So the first thing I usually like to do before I start building the application is to do a quick mock-up in Balsamiq, to come up and plan for how I'm going to lay things out and how the app is going to function. So this is what I've done here. You can see a basic mock-up of where I'm going to put the controls, both for a landscape layout as well as a portrait layout, including I've kind of added the keyboard in there to get a better feel of where, what parts of that is that going to overlay. So I plan for that. This planning is not perfect. You're always going to find that the dimensions of the device are a little bit different, or the keyboard's a little bit bigger than you expected. But it's a really good place to start, I find, to kind of have a mental model of how things are going to lay out. So this is that. Let's go on to creating a project now. So I'm going to start a new project. I'm going to use the empty activity. I'm going to name this project Rectangle Calc. The package name is already updated the way I want it to be: edu, Ranken, Paul Smith, Rectangle Calc. I do need to go and make sure it goes into the right folder. So for this project, I'll be putting it into those Unit 2 Simple Labs, that new repo. And I'm going to create a folder in here. Create a new folder. And I'm going to call that Rectangle Calc, because that's the name of my project. All right, so I'm going to select that folder and hit OK. So you'll see back here that I'm in my repo in that Rectangle Calc folder. So that's where I want to be. I've already got the language set to Java. My minimum SDK is 24. That's good. So I'm going to go ahead and hit Finish now that I've got that set up. I'm going to pause the recording here while it's working through creating that project, and then I'll resume when the project is created. And we're back. The project is finished being created. I've opened up the layout and I've put it into the designer view where I'm seeing both the design and the blueprint view. I want to go up here and do a few things first. I want to make sure that the system UI is on, so I'm previewing with that there. I'm also going to make sure that my default margins are set to 8. You may notice in the bottom right that there is a prompt in terms of adding project files to Git. I'm going to go ahead and say always add, because I do want those project files to be added. So do make sure you hit that if you see that. Okay, next up. So let's figure out how we're actually going to lay this out. If you remember looking at my blueprint, or my mock-up, you'll see that I kind of have these things arranged where I have the width field, the height field, and then an output for the area arranged from top to bottom. A little thing I might note there, you'll notice I have a calculate button, and I specifically put that up in the top right corner. The reason that I put it there is so it doesn't get obscured by the keyboard. Is by putting it up in that top right corner, I can make sure that the keyboard never overlaps it, which means I'm going to not have issues where, hey, the button the user needs to click is hidden because the keyboard is hiding it. So it's generally good practice to try and put your buttons more to the top right so that the user can see it, even if the keyboard is up. All right. So you might also notice in there that There is a label for every input. That's still good practice. You want to make sure you do that, and that's what I'm going to be doing there. Okay, so working from top to bottom, I'm going to go ahead and delete this little hello world text that we've got. I'm going to start dropping in controls. So I'm going to drop in a text view there. That's my first label for the width. I need to go down to text, and I need to grab one of these input fields, one of these edit texts to put in. It's worth noting that several of these inputs are really the exact same. Several with this icon, plain text, password, email, password numeric, email, etc. They actually give you the same. They all give you an edit text. The difference is what input they type. They start with pre-selected. I'm going to start with plain text as my starting point, just so we can kind of see how you change that input text and what some of the effects that has. So I'm going to start with those. Add another text view for the height input, another text view for the area, and then specifically note that I'm using a text view to output the area because I don't want that output to be editable. So I'm using text views there both for the label as well as the output will appear. Finally, I need to go back to common, and I'm going to drag in a button. Okay, so now I've got all of the components that I need to implement that layout that I've designed and planned out. I just need to now go through and kind of tidy some things up. Okay, you'll notice that I placed them around roughly where I want them to be, and I've already kind of set them, added them in the order that I want them. So this is rearranged already. I don't need to do too much in terms of reordering that. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and set all the IDs because I find that that's usually the easiest place to start and the best place to start, so I don't have to remember to do those things later. It really helps to get that project rolling. So the first one that I have, this is the width label. Boop. And yes, it's going to ask me to refactor it. I'm going to tell it okay. This is the width input. Yes, refactor. Next up is the height label, refactor, the height input, the area label, the area output, and finally the calculate button. So calc button. Okay, so now I've given those all IDs, and you can see already in the component tree that those IDs are now appearing. I find that that makes it a lot easier to kind of think about and see what's going on. Otherwise, I'm spending most of this time looking at like text view 1 and text view 2 and text view 3. It's like where is the thing that I'm interested in there? So I've done that part first. The next thing I'm going to do is go through and start setting some of the properties of those different components. And last, after I do all that, I'll finally start adding the constraints. So starting with the width label, I'm going to go down to the common attributes. Remember that there's two, right? So there is one without the wrench. That's going to set what it is at runtime versus the one with the wrench is going to set what it looks like in the designer. So this one, I do want this label to appear at runtime. So I'm going to go ahead and type in width there. It's going to go ahead and update in the designer. Next up, for the input box, I don't want any text to be there initially, but I do want some text in the designer so I can kind of judge and know how wide this is going to be, how much space it's going to take up. So I'm going to go ahead and set as the designer property, I'm going to go ahead and set mmm.mm. Okay, so that's going to give me an idea of saying, well, maybe I can go up to thousands with 2 decimal places. That's going to give me a good idea of how much space that's going to take up, so I don't end up using that space for other things. Next up is going to be another label. So this is just simply set to height. Next up is another field. So I'm going to remove this from the runtime one, and over on the other side, I'm going to do the same thing and add some text to kind of space it out. Next up is the area label. So area, and then where I put the output, I'm going to do a similar thing as I did for the input boxes, and I'm going to label it such that I can see how much space this would take up. So maybe go up to thousands, 2 decimal places, and that's going to give me a good idea of like how big this field is, and does it feel right compared to some of the other things on screen. Okay, so we've got that looking a lot better. You might notice on my mock-up that I went ahead and made all those labels bold and maybe made them a little bit bigger. So I am going to do that. I hold Control and then go select all these 3 components. I'm going to change them all at once. So I'm going to go to text style, make them bold. And I'm also going to change their text size, I think up to maybe 20 SP. Is that what size I did? Yeah, about 20 SP to get them into where I want to be. And similarly, I'm going to select these 2 inputs and the output and get their text size up to 20 SP as well. That way I've got the same text size for both the labels and the inputs, and that's going to make it look a little bit more consistent. By default in Android, the labels are actually, as you might have noticed, a little bit smaller than the input text size. But I find it easier to have them more congruent. All right, so we've got some basic styling there. I can start to go add. Oh, I do need to update the buttons. So the button, real quick, I do need to set its text. Under common, I'm going to go here and set a button. This is going to say calc, all in uppercase. Okay, so now that I've set that up, I'm going to go ahead and add the constraints. So in terms of constraints, I want to get those there. So I'm going to drag this, anchor that to the top right corner. You'll notice it already start with 8 because I've got a default margin of 8. I'm going to anchor the label up to the top left corner and then kind of work my way down. So that right there suffices as a basic sort of a start, right? So everything is kind of anchored. All my inputs and such, those fields are anchored to the top left versus my calculate button is anchored to the top right. Now, one of the things that I want is actually to stretch this out a little bit to take more advantage of the horizontal space that we have. So right now, those inputs, those labels are just taking up the space they need. But in reality, I want a wider area for the user to be able to click on. And so that means I need to stretch these things out. So in order to stretch it out, first I need to give some anchors. And that anchor is going to, first of all, tell it how far to stretch, as well as, limiting how far it can stretch. So I'm going to drag this over to the right. I'm going to drag this over to the right. I'm going to drag this over to the right. I'm going to drag this over to the right and that over to the right as well. Okay. Now you'll notice as I anchored all of those on both sides, they are now centered. Well, I want to go back to them taking up the full width. So I'm going to go select them all again. And I think that I'll have all except this last one selected there. So those are 4 selected. You'll notice I haven't touched the width label yet because I want to do something a little bit different there. So now in terms of those, I want to set their width all to match constraints. So that's going to stretch them out. Now, you might notice as soon as I did that, that it went ahead and changed the margins on the left and right to 0, which is just kind of a behavior that Android Studio is doing right now, but I need to go fix that. So maybe go down to layout margins, and I want to change the margins on the beginning and the end. So layout margin start is going to be 8 dp on all of these, and layout margin end is going to be 8 dp. That's going to add those margins back in. Good. Okay. So now let's talk a little bit about what's happening with this width label. I have a problem in that on that same row is also this calculate button, right? So I need to do something in my layout to make sure that it doesn't overlap the button. Okay, so the easy answer is, rather than connecting it or constraining it to the right side of the screen, I can connect it to maybe the right side of the button or the left side of the button. So that will keep it within that bounds. So let me go ahead and switch this over to match constraint. That's going to stretch it back out. Okay, so far so good. One caveat here, though, you might notice in the blueprint view that the width label now actually overlaps the button, and I really don't want that to be happening, so I need to make a little bit of an adjustment. Okay, there's more than one way I can do this. One way I can do this, which is maybe pretty simple, is I could go add a little bit more margin, maybe say, hey, this starts and is pushed down by 24 pixels at the top instead of 8, and that is going to avoid it, so you can see it's kind of underneath it. The other way I could have done it is maybe move the constraints around a little bit so that the width label is actually anchored to the calculate button and kind of shift things that way. I'm going to go ahead and for this example here, I'm going to leave this as that 24 spacing, because I think that might work better when we go to things like floating action buttons. So that's a start. Okay, so we've got this layout. Things are not overlapping. Things won't overlap, and we're all happy. The next thing I want to do is go to the maybe go to the design view just only and switch over to split. There are a few things. If you look at the code view, or you looked at the component tree, that you see that there's some warnings, there's some issues we need to correct. So I'm going to go through and fix those real quick before I get into maybe putting the code in place. So let's start from the top. First thing that we're suggesting is that the width, the string, really needs to be extracted. So I'm going to select it, go Alt-Enter, extract from string resource, and I'm going to call that string resource the width label, as that is the ID of this text view. Okay. Next up, I've got a similar sort of thing happening. I've got something a little bit different here. It's saying, well, this suggests that this should probably be some sort of number in terms of its input type. You'll notice the input type right now is text person name. That's because I added it in as plain text. What I actually want that to be is some sort of numeric type, and it's suggesting that to me. But I want to come back and actually do that a little bit later, so that you can see what it looks like if I don't set that to a numeric type, and we can kind of see what happens with there. So first I'm going to leave that as text person name for the moment. Next up, in terms of the height, I do need to extract this string resource again, and so this is going to be the height label. Again, it's suggesting that there should probably be this should be an input type of number of some sort. Going down to area, we have another label I need to extract, so area label. And for this one, I do notice here, this is Android text, when I do actually want this to be tools text, because I only want that to show up in the designer. One thing to note there, as soon as you put it under tools text, it won't ask you to extract it, because if it only shows up in the designer, there's no real need to translate it. So the only things you need to translate are things that are actually going to appear at runtime. If you mark it as text that only appears in the designer, there's no reason to extract it. Next up, the button. I need to extract the string resource there, and so this is going to be calc button following the ID of that button. I know that there's a little bit more that I need to do, so I'm going to go back up. One of the warnings that's still outstanding is that the edit text still need autofill hints. Also, I need to give a connected label for each of these inputs. So I'm going to do both of those things. So in terms of what I want to do for autofill hints, I can click here and go set autofill hints. Okay. Now there are a few pre-built options for this autofill. It's basically around what kind of thing should normally go in there. Noting that this is something that's kind of unusual. It's not an email or password. I actually am going to set a custom string in here, namely to say that this is a width. Okay. There really isn't anything built in, so I'm just going to type in my own string there. Similarly with the other edit text, I'm going to add the autofill hints and set it to height, because again, there isn't anything special there. So going back up, I need to add in, next up is label for, and you might notice that the kind of error is on the edit text, but where I actually need to put the label for property is not on the edit text, it's actually on the text view. The text view says this is a label for something else. So I'm going to say label for here. And this is the label for the width input. This text view is the label for the height input. And this is the label for the area output. Okay, so that's going to mark those and connect those together. It's like, okay, this label goes with this, and this label goes with this. I think that is the last piece that I needed to do here in terms of setting up the layout. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start actually setting up the code. I might want to check one thing real quick before I do that, and namely I do actually want to test the layout on the Nexus S, and we'll see how that works, just to make sure that what I've done is going to behave the way that I need it to. So give that emulator a second to start, and make sure it's in portrait mode to start with here. So there's a starting point of what the layout's going to look like. I can turn it into portrait and or landscape, and you'll see that it's still using that same portrait layout. I could go ahead and create the landscape and the tablet layouts right now, but I find it works better from a development paradigm and getting things done and in limiting rework to often do just the portrait view, just one layout first, go implement all the code, and then come back and do the additional layouts later. Otherwise, I find myself doing a lot of back and forth where maybe I find that, hey, I need to adjust the width, I need to adjust some elements because I forgot about some things I need, like maybe I need a place to show errors, maybe I need a place to show the output, or that looks a little bit different. Maybe I need some additional buttons or other fields and controls that I didn't think about at first. So I usually find it's best to get one working version before going to make the other variants. So I'm going to stop here with the layout process and do the landscape layout later. All right, pause. All right, so let's start working on the actual Java code that's going to implement how this application works. So I'm going to start first I'm going to go up to the top, and I'm going to start creating member variables for each of the inputs, each of the controls on the UI that I need to work with in code. So I'm going to start from the top. I need a private edit text. That's going to be, I'm going to maybe name this the same as what that field is. So this is the width input. I'm going to go ahead and hit Alt-Enter, so it automatically imports the edit text. You can see that up here now. I'm going to add another one, private edit text, height input. And so this process we're going to follow through for all of those inputs, all of those elements that you may have. So I've got, in this case, I've got two edit texts, and you'll notice that I've intentionally put those on two separate lines. Next up, I need a text view, and this is going to be for that area output field, because I need to also modify that in code. All right, so same Alt-Enter, import the text view, and let's go now to, oh, I also need an access to the button. So private button calc button, and I'm going to hit Alt-Enter to import that. So you'll see that I have button, edit text, and text view all are imported at the top now. Okay, so next up, I'm going to jump down into the onCreate method, because remember, the onCreate method runs when this activity comes on screen. So first up, I'm going to make a little comment so I can group my code together. I'm going to say, let's call this find the views, and we're going to start grabbing these views one by one by one. So we've asked for, we know we need these 4 different views. I'm going to get those down here. So width input is equal to find view by ID r.id dot width input, height input is equal to find view by ID r.id height input. The area output is find view by ID r.id dot area output. The calc button is find view by ID r.id dot calc button. Okay. Now, a common mistake here is sometimes when people are starting out, you might ask, well, why can't I just do this up here in one step? The problem with doing that here is that this actually happens basically too early. If you do it this way, you will find that you always, these views always come in null, because this code gets called before the constructor for main activity, before the class itself gets, the constructor code really gets a chance to run. Whereas when these can actually be called and obtained isn't until after set content view, right? You can't really call find view by ID until after set content view, because set content view is what we call does the inflation. It turns the layout into actual views. So before set content views, we don't actually have any views on screen. They don't exist. They haven't been created yet. So that's why I need to make sure that this call to find view by ID happens after set content view. Which also means it needs to inherently be here kind of in the onCreate or sometime later. Now, the reason that I do all this in onCreate, the other reason, in addition to it makes sure that it's late enough, is it ensures that I also only ever do it once, because the onCreate only gets called once when the activity comes on screen. So that avoids a lot of rework of, say, maybe calling find view by ID every time you click the button, etc. So I can keep that and reuse those references as my code requires. Now, because I'm only using them right now here in the constructor, you will see that there is a note and a highlight, maybe a warning on the fields that say, well, hey, these could actually be converted to local fields. And if I were to go here and hit Alt-Enter and take that, it would convert it here, take the member variable away, and make it a local field. The issue there is I'm going to go ahead and be using this in another place. So what might look like it could be okay as a local field right now won't look that way in a second. So I'm going to ignore that, and it's actually going to go away as I continue writing code. So the next thing I need to do is I need to register a listener for when that button is clicked. Okay, so I'm going to say let's register a listener. We're going to say when, let's say count button set on click listener. Okay, and here I'm going to use a lambda to register that listener or to create that listener. So I'm going to say it takes a view because I know that's what an on click listener takes. And I'm going to say it's going to call a method called calculate. Calculate. Now, I don't have that method yet. I'm going to create that here in a second. So let's go ahead and add another private method, private void calculate. Boop. And the key reason why I'm doing that is that serves to move the code out of the onCreate method into its own separate method. That way I don't have all this stuff polluting the onCreate method. So that's why I'm breaking it out that way. The other thing that this accomplishes is it allows me to reuse that calculate function, because it turns out that actually there are more things than just clicking the button that I would like to trigger the calculation. Okay, and that happens fairly frequently. Is oftentimes you want to trigger an operation from more than one pathway. So again, a good reason to separate things out into separate functions. Okay, so first thing I need to do in terms of when we click the calculate button is I need to go ahead and grab the input that users entered, namely that width and the height, and parse that and turn that into doubles, so that I can read and I can do calculations with those numbers. So if I start with what I have the width input. Okay, now that is, as we can see up here, that is an edit text, right? I can't do any calculations with that yet. I can't even parse it. So I need to actually ask for the text that is inside of that input first. What is the text that users typed in? Okay. That returns actually an editable, not a string. So I need to call toString, which will convert it from an editable to a string. Okay, now that I've got a string, I can pass that into double.parse double. Now, a common gotcha here, notice that this double is uppercase because it refers to a class. In Java, remember that the primitive types, namely double with a lowercase, cannot have methods. So in order for us to call methods, it has to be called on a class, right? Methods have to exist on a class. It's also worth noting that this parse double method doesn't return double with an uppercase letter. It returns double with a lowercase letter, actually. So when I take this back, it's going to be double width is what I'm going to name that variable. So double width is equal to double parse int with input get text, get string. I need to end this with a semicolon. A common mistake with people new to or even older to Java is a confusion between two different types. So like this double lowercase, remember this is a primitive type, just stores a number. Versus there is an uppercase double type. This actually is an object. It's actually a reference type. It's what we call one of the boxed types. Namely, what it does is it wraps, as you can kind of see in the tooltip, it's a wrapper for the double primitive type. So you basically have an object that contains a double. One of the caveats there is this can actually, because it's an object, can be null, but it also takes up more memory and results in slower calculations because there's an object involved. So to make sure that this is quick and I'm not allocating additional memory, not allocating additional objects, I want to make sure I'm using that lowercase double here. Next up, I'm going to do the same thing with the height. So double height. And now that I know how to kind of work this through, I'm going to just repeat the same process kind of in reverse. So double parse double, height input dot get text dot toString. All right, so now I have both the width and the height. And a common thing you might want to do at this point is go ahead and log those values. So I might do a log.i. I might want to log, let's say the tag here is main activity, and I want to go ahead and log that the width is equal to width, value of the width variable, log.i, main activity, and comma, and my message here is the height is equal to the height. So that way I can quickly look at logcat and just see that I'm properly reading those inputs. Where I want to be. All right, so let's go ahead and test this. Now I notice immediately here that I need that to be main activity with an uppercase A. So I'm going to run this on the Nexus S. And I'm going to start trying to type some values in. So 12 and 34. I'm going to hit calc. I'm going to look at logcat, and I should see those numbers, which I do, right? So here I see is an informational message. I can filter down maybe to info. I've got main activity, width is 12 and height is 34. So I can see that those values are being read and properly processed. So that can help me in terms of figuring out and diagnosing problems. So oftentimes I might put a header on here and say, well, the first step that we're doing is parsing the inputs. Next up, I need to actually calculate what the output is. And so calculating the output here is pretty simple. I'm just going to say double area is equal to the width times the height. Okay, so I've got the area calculated. Now I need to actually show it. So I'm going to show the output. It's helpful to me to often do these in two steps, to do the calculation and then the showing, to keep the presentation logic a little bit separated. So here I want to get this to a string, right? Because I can't just show a double, I can't just show a number. I actually need to have a string that I'm going to show. So what I would like to have is a formatted message here. So I'm going to say area formatted. Question is how do I do that formatting? There's more than one way you can do that. You can use string format to do that, but here I'm going to actually use one of the built-in number format objects. So I'm going to use NumberFormat. NumberFormat class has a bunch of different methods, a bunch of different static methods, which will get you different number formats that work internationally based on the culture of whoever's using the device. So for instance, if I wanted to output currency, I could get a currency instance, but if I want to output a percentage, I could get a percentage instance, but here I just want to output a number, so I'm going to get a number instance. Okay. Now, because I'm just using this once, I'm going to go ahead and directly call format, and I'm going to format the area, and that's going to take it from being a double into being a locale specific string. So that's going to put in periods for the decimal place, commas for the thousand separator, or let's say this was running on maybe a EU locale, then it would do the reverse. You know, it would put maybe commas as the decimal separator, or in periods as the thousand separator, and similar behavior like that. Okay, now that I've got it as a string, I can actually show it to the user. So area output set text, and I'm going to set the text to area formatted. Okay, so that's going to display that calculation formatted again in the user's locale. So I'm going to run this now. Okay, so if I type in, say, 10 and 20, we go ahead and calculate, and something happens, right? You might notice that the log did spit out, but it's not visible maybe to the user that anything occurred when I hit that calculate button. The problem is that it's hidden by the keyboard, right? It's down here, right? So it works, but it's maybe not user-friendly because the output like that is hidden. Let me show you one other kind of caveat here. So I'm going to type in again 10, go next, 20, and hit the done button here. You'll notice when I hit that done button on the keyboard, it didn't actually do the calculation. The user has to go up here and hit calc. Which is really kind of not what I want. I want the user to be able to hit done here on the keyboard, and that triggered the calculation. I don't want that two-step if they both have to dismiss the keyboard and press the button, right? I want that, basically, that dismissal of the keyboard to initiate the operation, right? Similarly, you know, notice that when I hit calc, it doesn't dismiss the keyboard. So these are all things I needed to, right? So what we have right now is really maybe a first cut, right? It sort of works, right? It works as in the happy path, maybe. If you have a user that kind of knows what they're doing and there's enough screen space, it might be satisfactory. But this is really not where we want to leave an app, right? So this is a starting point, and this is definitely what I would write first, right? This is the first cut that I'm making of this application, but it is by no means done. Just let me be clear about this. Like if you call this done, you're not there, right? This is not what I'm looking for from lab assignments, right? What I'm looking for is something that is much more user friendly. So thinking about, you know, how does it work with the keyboard? You know, thinking about, you know, what happens when I press this next button or this done button on the keyboard. Does pressing a button dismiss the keyboard? How do I display those outputs? Or for instance, if I leave these fields blank, you might notice that it goes ahead and crashes the application. Those are all problems, right? And those are problems that we really need to solve in order to build a quality application. Okay, so while this is, again, that first cut, there really are things that we need to do beyond that in order to consider something that you know, meets the specifications, that meets the user's needs, and is something that's really worth selling. Okay, so I'm going to kind of pause the video here so you can kind of review what we have so far, and then we're going to come back and I'm going to add and enhance this with some of those features that really are not optional but required. Okay. So as my first enhancement to this, I want to add some logic to hide the keyboard when the user presses the calculate button. So to do that, I'm going to add another method here down at the bottom, and this is code that I kind of given you before. I'm really going to say, you know, copy it as is because there's a lot of there's kind of a lot of weird stuff going on with it. This is something that you can find bits and pieces of it over Stack Overflow, but the way I write this is a little bit different. So I'm going to write a method called hideKeyboard. It's going to take two parameters. One is the context, and the other one is a view. That's kind of inherent because of the APIs that we need to use. It requires you to have a context to work with, which context here is the activity. In other contexts, in other spaces, it may be something a little bit different. and a view, just we need to have some sort of UI element to interact with and to make this work. It turns out it oftentimes doesn't matter much what view you're using, other than it has to be one that's actually on screen at the time you call this method. Okay, and it can't be null. So first thing I need to do is get what's called the input method manager. Input method manager. I'm going to call this the IMM for short. This is really used to work with, this object is used to work with that soft keyboard, right? So that soft keyboard is what we call an input method. And so this is the manager, the thing that works with, and it's not the input method, it's not the soft keyboard itself, but it manages the soft keyboard. Okay. Now to get this, I need to call from the context. I need to call getSystemService. Okay, so getSystemService provides a way to get a broad variety of different kinds of services. Okay, and so here specifically, I need to give it a string. The string key tells us which service that I want, and so I'm going to do activity .input method service, use that constant to say here's the one that I want. Now you might notice it's appearing in red. Problem is that this returns an object. It's not actually casted down to the thing I need it to be. So I actually have to explicitly cast it to an InputMethodManager by virtue of knowing that that's what I get back when I ask for the input method service. This getSystemService returns a broad variety of services that you can do a lot of things in Android, but each of them, depending on what key you give, will give you back a different kind of service, a different kind of object. So this has been kind of a long-standing thing where you have to know what it is, what is the corresponding type of that, and then cast it down to there. Oftentimes when you're looking at the way to find this in the documentation is you look at the constant in particular here. So over on input method service, I can see that it retrieves an input method manager. So oftentimes you can see that in the documentation for the constant that you're using. Next up, now that I have that IMM, I can actually call the method that I need to call. And the specific method I want to call is hideSoftInput from window. The short explanation of that is hide, obviously make it go away. Soft input, meaning the soft keyboard, the way that users entering the input, software-based input, and then we say from window. Well, what's a window? Long story short, a window is actually a view, right? Every view you got on screen is a window. Other times, if I remember right, the other thing that happens, I believe that the activity itself is also a window. And so internally, there is this idea of a window similar to how things work on Windows. Everything you see on screen in Windows is really a window. And this works sometimes on Linux in the X Windows world, the same kind of idea where things are windows. So inherently, I have to get that underlying window, which is not something we normally work with. It's not something we usually work with directly. Usually we're working with activities and views. But for this specific API, you have to call down and work with the window itself, unfortunately. From there, what we actually need, this method to hide it takes two parameters. Basically, it needs to know, well, what window do you want to hide it from? And then another thing, another which is sort of flags, a series of things you can change the behavior with. Okay, so the first argument, the way I'm going to get that is I'm going to use a method called view get window token. That's going to give a token for the window that's attached to or connected to the view. the details behind that aren't all that important, but basically it's an ID for that window. The next parameter, as I said, is flags. Okay, so those flags would normally be combined with or. You'd say, hey, I want flag A or flag B or flag C, but because I don't want to change any sort of the default behavior, I want to keep the default behavior here, I'm just going to pass 0, saying that I'm setting no flags. Okay, so 0 says we don't need to set any specific flags. So this method there, okay, that's going to kind of take care of given the activity and given a view, is going to hide the soft keyboard, and then I don't have to worry about some of these internal details of this InputManager service, which is kind of typically something we want to kind of hide like this. So now that I've got that method, I'm actually going to go up to here where I've hooked up the button, and this is where I'm going to call hideKeyboard. It's worth noticing that I'm intentionally not adding it into the calculate function itself, because under some contexts I may want to do the calculation but not hide the keyboard, versus in this specific case I do want to do both. So in this case I do need to add, you'll notice that I've done kind of a single line. This is a shorthand format, only allows me to really call one function. In order to call two functions, I need to add some curly braces, push this down. Now that I've got curly braces, this needs to have a semicolon to end the line, and now I can add in a call to hideKeyboard. And so that's going to take the context is going to be this activity, and the view that I'm going to use, I believe the view that I want to use is the calc button. Again, it doesn't actually matter too much which view you use, as long as it's one that's on screen. So I'm going to say, go look in this activity for the soft keyboard and close it or hide it. So there we've got it. So I'm going to say hide keyboard. When you click the button, hide the keyboard, and then do the calculation. What that's going to change, as you can see here, go back, hit 10, 20, calculate, okay, keyboard goes away. That's already significantly better. Okay, that may seem like such a minor thing to hide the keyboard like that, but is a huge thing in terms of usability of your applications. Okay, so this is a snippet that I keep handy. I actually keep it in a tool called grepper, which is a plugin for my browser, because I constantly find myself needing to reuse this and rehatch it for all sorts of Android projects. All right. So next up, we've looked at kind of how to set up functionality to hide the keyboard on button press. What I want to talk about next is how to deal with actions from the keyboard itself. So I'm going to go ahead and run this application again from the start. And one thing that I want to look at next is, let's say I say 10, 20. I want to handle what this button does. So you'll notice right now, when I click that, the keyboard goes away, but nothing else happens, right? So it's not calling the calculate function. The calculate function only gets called when I press the calculate button, not when I press that, what we call the done key on the keyboard. Okay, you might notice on these different fields it's a different icon, right? So this is what we call the next button. This is what we call the done button. So I need to hook up additional listeners to respond to those events in particular. You know, I want to say when you click next, I want to go ahead and run the calculation. When you hit done here, I also want to run the calculation. Okay, so let's start with just the done key here. The way I'm going to hook this up is I'm going to go back up to onCreate. Right, so I've already hooked on in one listener, right? One listener that responds to the calculate button. I need to hook up another listener for the height input because that's my last input on this field. Now, rather than hooking up an on-click listener, the on-click listener would be when I click on it, I'm going to hook up what's called an OnEditorActionListener. Okay. Now the EditorActionListener responds to that sort of done next key, whatever that key is in the bottom right, which actually can be a few different things. It can even be like a search, a spyglass. It can be a few different sorts of actions. I want to hook up to when that button is pressed. Okay. So in order to hook that up, this is, again, it's a function. Like I can write it as a lambda, as it is an interface that takes just simply has one method you need to override. The gotcha is there are a few things that it takes. Okay, so the OnEditorActionListener, this method here actually receives 3 different inputs. Now I can do a little bit of research in the IDE itself to figure out what that signature is. So in fact, if I right click on this method and I say go to implementation, it will actually take me to the Java code that actually implements this API. You'll notice that it takes a text view OnInteractionListener. I can go into that class. It'll take me down here. Okay, so now I can see the signature of this function, right? It returns a Boolean, as you can see, and we can talk about what that is. It has a method. This interface has a method called OnEditorAction. Is the name of it, and it takes 3 parameters. Okay, so it takes the text view, it takes an integer, and it takes a key event. Okay, unfortunately, when you're looking at it here, it doesn't actually tell you the name of what these are. It just says var1, var2, var3, which is, it gives you the type information, but not what these mean. Like, what does this integer here mean? So in order to find that, I typically have to go to the online documentation and find those names. Now, I've already done that work, so I'm going to go ahead and bring that in here and start typing out what this is going to be. So the first one is the text view. Okay, the name of this is view, right? So that basically is the text view that triggered this event, which turns out that this view here is going to be height input, because height input is triggering the editor action event. So there's that view. The next is an integer, and this represents the action ID. So that's one of a few constants that represents like what icon was showing on your soft keyboard. So was it like the next key, was it the done key, was it the search key, etc., etc., etc. So that will tell you which of those actions is being taken. Which is really helpful when you're trying to hook maybe the same editor action listener to multiple different inputs. Here I'm going to be hooking specific action listeners to different inputs. So I'm going to have one listener I'm going to use for the width input and another one for the height input. So I'm not going to try to reuse that code, but it's helpful if you want to. And the final argument is what we call a key event. This is the event, okay? So that's the event that actually triggered or led to this operation, okay? It's worth mentioning that this, if you click on the that done button, will be basically the done key in some sense, versus if you can also trigger this event by pressing enter on your physical keyboard, say on your laptop. If you press enter, that key event will actually tell you which key was pressed, that it was the enter key, for instance. So this can also be sometimes good to introspect. But for this example here, I actually don't care about any of these 3 inputs. I do have to specify those parameters, but I'm not going to do anything with those parameters. So we're going to keep that simple. So in response to you triggering the editor action listener, I actually want to do basically the same thing as when you hit the calculate button. So first thing I need to do is I need to hide the keyboard. And so I'm going to say this. This is related to the height input field. And then I'm going to say, let's call calculate. And then remember that this function has to return a Boolean, either true or false. And basically, what that says here in this context is the meaning of true is says, hey, I've I've dealt with that event. I've captured it. I'm taking care of everything that needs to happen. Don't do any of your default behavior, and don't keep bubbling that event further. Don't let anything else deal with that event because I've already taken care of it. So if I return true there, you can kind of think of it as like that prevent default that you're maybe familiar with. If I return false, I'm basically not setting prevent default. I'm saying, okay, keep doing your default behavior. So for here, I'm going to leave that as return false. Go ahead and do your default behavior. It turns out that basically I've already done it. The default behavior is to hide the keyboard, but we don't need to get interrupted. We don't need to interrupt that behavior. So I'm going to just say return false. All right, let's try to run this now. So when I run this, I should be able to type in 10, tab, 20, hit the done key, and voila. It's gone ahead and done the calculation when I press done on the keyboard, and it now works either way. I can either press done on the keyboard or I can press this calculate button up there. And so this is part of that benefit of having extracted my logic to this calculate function, is I can now reuse it through different pathways. You know, whether it's through the soft keyboard or whether it's through the button, both of those can reuse that same calculation logic. Okay. Next up, I want to address some of the error handling problems. So if we try to run this program as is right now, you might notice that it crashes if I leave the fields blank. So if I hit calc, boom, boom, the whole application's gone. Okay, this happens. These are things that we need to diagnose and we need to fix. So the way that you begin to diagnose crashes like this is you first go to your logcat view, and I'm going to attach it to my, make sure it's attached to the right device. So it's attached to the Nexus S emulator. It's attached to my app. You can see that it's dead because it's already crashed. And I've filtered down to just errors. Now, you might see that there's already a stack trace in here. I'm going to go ahead and run it, recreate it, so you can see this happen live. So when I go in here, I'm going to hit calc. And you see immediately when I did that, said, hey, keep stopping. There's an error here. But here is a stack trace, right? So it's actually telling me a bit about what went wrong, what occurred, and this is really helpful from being able to, from perspective of being able to diagnose where the problem is, okay? A lot of times you might have a crash like this and you don't necessarily know what caused it. So your first place to look is to go into logcat and look for errors. And so notice importantly that I'm filtering down to errors. I'm just looking at errors. So that makes sure if you're outputting things indicate a crash, any information that you have like that, make sure it's logged at the error level so that you can do this process. If you log these things and say info or debug, it's going to make it a lot harder to find out why the crash is occurring if you change how that behaves. Okay, so let's look at what we've got. So we got a number format exception, and it's complaining about there being an empty string. Okay, well that gives us some indication. Basically, the reason that it's crashing is because I left the fields blank. I didn't enter a value there. Okay, so let's get some more specific. So it came from this parse double method. Well, where am I calling parse double? I'm calling it on lines 50 or lines 51, right? Those are two places I know right now that I'm calling parse double. So it's got to be one of those two. If I keep digging down further, you're going to find that it actually tells me exactly what line caused it. So here I can click on this in blue, main activity line 50. It will take me directly there. So line 50 is what caused it. Right, so line 50 is what's causing that crash. Now I might do a little bit more testing. So I might see, okay, so it's when line 50, when that width field is blank, is when it's crashing right now. But it also crashes in another condition. So let's say I just enter a value for the width, but not for the height. Calculate. You'll see it crashes there as well, but it crashes on line 51, right? So if I enter the width, it makes it through this line 50. It's able to parse the width because there's a valid width there, but they'll still get down to the height and crash there. Okay, so what I need to do is I need to use a try-catch statement, right, that is going to capture this specific type of exception, a number format exception. It's worth mentioning I don't want to have that try-catch catch all types of exception. I don't want to say try-catch exception, that's the parent class, because that would catch other kinds of exceptions like null pointer exceptions, which are things I actually need to address typically and prevent from happening in the first place. So on the other hand, this number format exception, we actually basically don't have any way to prevent from happening. We don't know really until we've called parse double if it's going to fail, right? We can't necessarily anticipate that to know what's there. I could check if it's an empty string, but empty string is not the only thing that makes that invalid. So for instance, other things that make that invalid are, say, I can go in here because this is a text type. You notice there's a full keyboard here. Well, obviously there's letters there. That's not a valid string. Okay, that's not a valid number. Other things that are not valid numbers, I could put a single dot in here. Not a valid number, right? But it's not empty string. So you can't just say, okay, well, the only case that makes the exception happen is it's an empty string. There are many more cases that can cause this as well, right? So you see a single dot causes it. It's still a number format exception, but the message is different for input string dot. So I need to make sure that I catch that number format exception to make sure I'm catching and dealing with cases that I might not have anticipated. Okay, so one way I can set this up is I could say, okay, this is the part that fails, right? These two lines are the ones that fail. So maybe I wrap this in a try-catch statement, just these two lines. Okay, try catch, where I catch a number format exception, EX. And when that occurs, then I might say, let's first of all, I want to make sure I log the exception so I can see what's going on there. So main activity. And my message is failed to parse input. Third argument here is the actual exception. This is kind of an interesting trick, which is really important to understand, is if you call logged E, then you can actually add a third argument, which is the exception object. What that's going to do is allow us to see these full details, the stack trace that we had. Otherwise, we lost that information when we had this try catch. So I'm doing that to recreate this, to re-add this functionality that helps me diagnose problems like this. So next up, if that happens, I probably need to indicate that to the user in some way, shape, or form. So I might want to say area output dot set text, and maybe I say just invalid data for the moment, right? Maybe I just spit out a placeholder message for the moment. I need to also make sure that the rest of the code doesn't happen. So I'm going to go ahead and return from this function at this point and say, okay, don't run the rest of the code here because we don't have valid input data. Now, you might notice here that this is in red. It's saying cannot resolve symbol with cannot resolve symbol height. Well, the problem is these variables are now scoped to just within the try. Nowhere else can get access to them. They're scoped down within these curly braces. Okay. Well, I need to fix that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually extract these and allow them to be accessed from a bit of a wider scope. So I'm actually going to define them up here. Double width. I'm going to start the width and assume that it's 0. And I'm also going to start the height as 0 as well. So there we go. Double height, double width is 0, double height is 0. And so these are defined, initialized up here, and then I'm going to assign a value to them down here. Okay. So now that that's been done, these are now accessible down to this code further down. So let me try this again. Okay. So if I try to leave these fields blank, just go ahead and hit calc, it's going to go ahead and spit invalid data out there. It's not going to crash, but it will still produce the stack trace for us. It'll still say number format empty string, so I can still diagnose some of these issues. You'll notice the line number has changed, line 54, because I've moved the code around, so it's now on line 54. So that can help me kind of track things down and help it not crash, right? So that's one way I can deal with this. In reality, usually I want to know what particular field caused the problem, right? Because just spitting out invalid data doesn't tell me which one is it, right? So like if I type in 1234, go ahead and hit calculate. Okay, we've got 408. If I leave that field blank and submit it, oh, well, we've got invalid data. Valid data doesn't tell me which of the two fields is the problem, right? So the problem is that our try-catch here is maybe a little bit too broad. It's covering both possible fields that could be invalid, right? So what I often find that I need to do is I need to create a separate try-catch for each individual input, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually add a second one, try catch number format exception EX. And I'm going to put that same logic in there. So it's going to do the same thing in this catch. But what I'm doing here, this is the important part, is I'm going to move the part that parses the height down to the second one. So this first one is going to try and parse the width. This one's going to try and parse the height. If this one fails, then I can be more specific, right? So I can say fail to parse the width, and maybe say that the width is invalid here. Where did it go? There. So I might say invalid width. In here I can say fail to parse height and invalid height, right? So the difference here is that it's going to tell the user which of those two is the problem with, right? Is the problem with the width or is the problem with the height? So if I hit calculate now, it says invalid width. Okay, I go fix the width, hit calculate again. All right, invalid height is our problem. 34, calculate. Awesome, right? So that gives the user some more indication about where the problem is. That is really, really important, right? That is really important to the user to know, like, what field do I need to go and correct. So it's important to indicate that to the user. Now, you might notice here, right, if they're both invalid, this code as is does not generate an error for both. It doesn't tell you both the width and the height are incorrect. The reason for that is when we have the width being invalid, we have this exception we're immediately returning at this point, right? So we return here means the rest of this code doesn't get a chance to run. So that's kind of inherent of how I've taken that approach. That's fine for these labs. That's kind of what I want. I want it to just tell the user what the first error is, because that kind of ends up with the best experience. Space is limited on mobile devices, so if I tell the user all the errors that are there, more likely it will overwhelm them. So I'm just going to tell them what the first error is, just that the width is invalid. Now, you might have noticed here that this message is in yellow. The reason is that it's giving me some suggestions that, just like where I had with the layout, that here's a string that's user visible, probably should be extracted. So just like I did with the layout, I extracted things to strings XML. Messages like this in the Java code also need to be extracted. So the way that we do that, same way, Alt-Enter, extract string resource. That's going to bring up this dialog, and so I'm going to write this as error invalid width. Okay, so that's going to replace it now. Rather than the string being directly there, it's going to replace it with r.string.error invalid width. Now it's worth noting here that this is actually an ID for that string. It's actually an integer. So this is actually calling a different version of setText that takes an integer resource ID rather than actually passing a string. Like, this is actually not a string anymore, it's an integer. But it's gone ahead and dealt with that for me when I did that extract string resource. Similar here, I'm going to go ahead and extract that string resource, error invalid height. Right? So now I have those things extracted. Okay, that's good. Other things I want to do, you might notice that when the error occurs, right? So when I hit calculate here, that invalid width or that invalid height, those are just displayed in black. I might want to color code these things. So I might want to say, hey, if it's successful, right, let's show it in green. If it's not successful, let's show it in red. Okay. So what I'm going to do before I put that into the code is I'm actually going to define a pair of color constants over in colors.xml, right? So that way I can find them in one place and reuse those colors as my program needs them. So going over colors.xml, we've already got a color palette that's in there. I'm going to add my own set of colors. So you'll see that all of these colors have a name. So the first one I'm going to add as the success color. Okay, and this is going to be the constant here. You might notice are hexadecimal, but they're 8 characters in length. That's because the first 2 characters are the transparency. So if you put in FF, it's fully opaque. If you put in 0, it's fully transparent. So I do want these colors fully transparent, fully opaque. So I'm going to do FF. And then I want to specify that this is roughly a green, but not a full green. So we've got red, and then green, and then blue. So 0 for the red, CC, Charlie, Charlie, for the green, 0, 0 for the blue. I'm going to add another one, which is going to be my error color. So color name error. And this is going to be, again, FF for the transparency. For the red, I'm going to do Charlie, Charlie. For the green, 0, 0. And for the blue, 0, 0. Now, it's worth mentioning that this is not case sensitive. Lowercase letters and uppercase letters are the same, right? But for consistency with other code that's in here, I'm going to go ahead and make these uppercase C's. So we got FF 00 CC 00 for the success color, which is going to give us a green. We can kind of preview it here, versus the error was FF CC 0000, which gives us this red, sort of muted red and muted green. All right, so that's all good. So I'm going to go back now to my main activity, and I'm going to incorporate those colors. Now, it oftentimes happens that you may want to reuse these colors, so I might want to go ahead and add those up here as member variables. So I'm going to mark this section as these are my views. I'm going to have another section here of member variables called my colors. And so here I might have private int success color, private int error color. Okay, so you might notice that these colors are stored as integers, right? And that's basically parsed from these hexadecimal values. Will give you that 32-bit integer. Okay, now in order to actually fill those out, I need to go into my onCreate, and I'm going to do this between find views and register listeners. I'm going to say, let's get the colors. Okay, so we're going to get the colors. The way that we get the colors, I'm going to say, like, hey, let's get the success color. That's called get color. Okay, so you might notice the get color takes an integer and returns an integer. So it takes the ID of the color and returns the actual color value. Both of those are integers, but they're different integers. You're going to pass in one integer and get a different integer out. So here I'm going to use r.color.error. So that's the ID, or actually success. So this is the ID of that color, but it's going to return the actual color code. Okay, so that get color call in the middle is doing some translation and looking things up in our resources. Next up, I want the error color, get color, r.color.error. I could have done this as fewer steps, maybe putting, skipping the member variable idea, just asking and calling get color when I needed it, rather than doing this at the head. But just like where I said with find view by ID, my goal here is to put things into onCreate so that I only have to do them once and not have to do them multiple times. That's what I'm achieving here, is I'm putting into that member variable so that I don't have to call it every time I need that color. I've done it once and I don't need to do it again. All right, so we come back here. So in the case where it is invalid, I might want to say area, maybe I'll do this first. So area output set text color. And so we're going to change the text color to error color here. Similarly, I'm going to change it to error color here. In the case where the height is invalid, so whether whether it's invalid here, or whether the width is invalid or the height is invalid, I want to mark both of those red. I also need to go back down to the success case here and say area output dot set text color, and rather than setting it to error, I'm going to set it to success. So success color here. All right, so what this is going to achieve, again, is if it's an error, if there's a problem with the data, we're going to see the message or the output in red. If it is successful, then the output's going to be in green. All right, so 10, 20, calculate, and then if I go ahead and remove one of these, calculate, that's invalid. You can see it's in red, so there we go. So that's kind of what I want to see, and I can go back to 34, enter, all good. So that really helps from a user standpoint to just change the colors of errors and success, so you can kind of indicate those things. All right, one last thing I might want to do, oftentimes, and this is kind of this is more of a subjective thing. Oftentimes, I may want to go ahead and calculate the output when I press, say, next on this field, rather than waiting for later. It's not really obvious here because the output is hidden. But if I were to go, maybe not try this on the Nexus, but try this on our 7-inch tablet, we would see where that might be more of an issue. So if I pull this up, give it a chance to start. Scale it up a little bit. Oop. Because the screen is bigger, when I'm typing in, the output isn't hidden. So to deal with that, I'm going to go ahead and add in 10, actually I'm going to just leave these blank. I'm going to go ahead and calculate. So 10, 20, enter, okay, it calculates. But I might want it to immediately change when I hit next there, right? So that's often a kind of an overlooked thing that you might see on the tablet more than you might necessarily see on the phone. So to deal with that, you'll notice that I put up an OnEditorActionListener for the width, the height, but I haven't added one for the width. So I want to add one here. I want to say width input dot set OnEditorActionListener. That signature is going to be the same as what we see below. So I'm going to say, okay, we need to take a text view, an action ID, and an event. Okay, so we take those three things here. I won't hide the keyboard because this is just trying to go to the next input. So I want to keep the keyboard up. I do want to go ahead and do a calculate, and I do want to return false to allow it to go to the next field. If I return true here, that would prevent the default behavior, which that default behavior is to go or to change the focus to the next input. So that's one of the reasons why we want to return false. Okay, so let's say I set that up. All right, so what we're going to see is if I hit 10 and I go ahead and go to the next thing, all right, we're going to go ahead and see that it immediately starts spitting the output there. I hit that. If I go back here, change it to say 40 and hit next, you'll see that it's doing the calculation, not just when I change the height input, but it's also doing it when I change the width input. So oftentimes I do want that behavior. I do want the editor action listener to be hooked up for all of the inputs, all of the edit texts. Cool. So that's another piece there in terms of getting it to a point where it is much more user-friendly. I still need to do maybe a handful of things with the layout, but we are almost done. One thing you might notice at this point is that the keyboard that pops up is actually a text keyboard, right? It's a text-based keyboard. It's a full keyboard, when really all I want is numbers, right? In fact, to get the numbers on there, I have to kind of hold, click, and that will get me to the numbers, or I could switch over here, but I would like it to be just showing the numbers, right? So the way I do that is I go back to the layout, and for each of these inputs, so I'm going to go up and let's look at the width input. You might notice that the input type is, right now it's text person, okay, text person name. What I want to do is change it over to be some sort of number. Now there's actually 3 different options for number. There's number itself, there's number decimal, and there's number signed. Each of these 3 options gives you a slightly different keyboard. And a slightly different behavior to the field. So let's start with just number. Okay, so if I just say that the width has to be, or the input type for width is a number, okay, I'm going to get this different keyboard, right? This keyboard just looks like it has number symbols in there, but you might notice that I can't push the period, right? Or I can't make it negative. Okay, so number, if you specify as number, it has to be a positive number, and it can't actually contain decimals. So if I want it to contain decimals, then I have to change this to number decimal, try it again. And what you'll see now is I can say like 1, 2, 3, dot 56, and that will give me a decimal type thing. It's worth mentioning that you do have to watch for the fact that this now allows you to have things like just a single dot, which is going to cause an exception when you go to try to parse that. So you do have to consider for some of those cases still. Also worth noting is I can't put a signed number in there. So for instance, if I did want to have a signed number, I might try to change this over. If I didn't want negative numbers, I might change this to number signed. Try to run it again. When it pops up, okay. So now I can say like 1 and say negative 123, right? So if I number signed allows me to do that. Now notice that number signed doesn't allow me to put decimals in there. So if I want both negative numbers and decimals, I need to specify both of those things. And the way we specify both of those things is like so. I say number decimal or number signed. You'll notice that single pipe in there because it's bitwise anding these two flags. Bitwise ORing with these flags. So if I say now I can say -123 dot 56, and so that's what I get if I put in both number decimal and number signed, is you get both negatives and decimals. Well, for this, I don't actually want negatives in terms of dimensions. I want only positives, but I do need to allow for decimal points. So the type that I'm going to use for both of these inputs is actually going to be number decimal. Both of these I want to set to number decimal. So I'm going to change that here. Okay, that's good. Other things you might want to do, you saw kind of the buttons that appear when you enter and when you type and you're working with those. When on the keyboard there's that kind of done button here or the next button. I can change how that works, change how that looks using imeOptions, short for input method. So for instance, I could say, well, it should be the next button. I could say it could be the done button, go button, none. There shouldn't be one, previous, search, send, etc. So there's a bunch of different actions that you can specify. So oftentimes I find it helpful to go ahead and specify these things. So for instance, I might say this is action done, because this is when I submit the form. Another option I could pick here is go. So maybe let's try go. Let's see what happens when I put in go here. And for the first one, I'm going to set the imeOptions to next. So the next key should appear on the width, and the go button should appear on the height. So we click here, we see the same thing. That's the next button. When I go over here, we see this little arrow. Again, that is the go button. So there's a slight difference between like what that icon looks like, depending on what action you select. So that's oftentimes something we want to play around with, especially if it's not picking the default, the correct default behavior for and look for that button. Okay, so imeOptions is an important thing to remember. Let's see, another thing I need to do is go back to the Nexus and take a look there. So if I look at the Nexus and we bring up this keyboard, boop, you might notice that I don't have the ability to scroll while the keyboard is up. Okay, so two things I need to do. I do need to go ahead and get it to resize this view when the keyboard's up, and I also need to have it introduce that scroll view. Okay, so first things first, why don't we go ahead and change the resize behavior. So the way you change the resize behavior is we go up to the manifest, and here on the activity tag, zoom in a little bit, I'm going to set the windowSoftInputMode, and we're going to set this to adjustResize. So the mode for when the keyboard's up is it should resize the activity to adjust the space that is visible anymore. So that's going to make it basically get smaller when the thing is out. That's going to enable us to scroll and such. Now for the scroll, I'm going to add another layout. This new layout, I'm going to say new layout resource file. Now I'm going to name it based on the activity that I already have. So the activity I already have is activity_main. This one I'm going to call activity_main, activity_main_scroll. Right? So we have one version of the layout that doesn't have a scroll bar, scroll view, and another version of the layout that does have a scroll view. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and add that. It's going to give me this simple setup here. You might notice that it already has a constraint layout on it. I don't really want that constraint layout, so I'm actually going to do away with it. What I actually want here is just a scroll view. So we're going to replace that and bring in that scroll view. I think I have the code for that somewhere here. Let me just pull that in. Okay, okay, so I'm going to pull this down. I still need to keep the XML namespace. I'm going to change the tag to a scroll view. There. It didn't change the end tag, so I need to change that manually. Scroll view. Okay. And it is important that the width and height of the scroll view needs to be match parent, because we do want the scroll view to extend and fill the full space that's there. Now, inside of there, I need to add an include tag, which is where we're going to include the other layout. I need to specify the dimensions of that include. So we need to make sure that the width of that is match parent. We want to extend the layout to the width of the scroll view. And we need to set the height to wrap content. So it's only as tall as it needs to be, which allows it then to be scrolled. Again, if I set that height to match parent, it is going to cause problems and is not going to make the scrolling work. So I need to make sure that that height is wrap content. It's worth noting that this height and width will override the root of what's in this layout. So at the root of this layout, it does say match parent. But as far as it's concerned, once we've included it here, it's going to change the width and height of that constraint layout that's on the outside. The last property I need to set is the layout, and the layout's going to point to activity main. Now, as soon as I do this, you're going to see the designer updates, and now it reflects that layout that's there. So I can see what it looks like as a whole with the other layout that is being included. All right, so let's take a look at this on the Nexus S, and we should see with those things in place, maybe there's a scroll. Maybe? Oh, maybe not. Okay, so there's one thing I forgot to do. There's one thing I forgot to do here, which is kind of a common mistake, is I need to go back up to the Java class, the main activity, and change this to be activity main scroll. Okay, so it knows that it's inflating that scroll view instead of the one that was previously inflating. Okay, so we inflate that one instead. Go ahead and hit run. Did it run? I'm not sure it did. Okay. There we go. So now we can see that that scroll bar appears when the keyboard's up. It goes away as soon as the keyboard's gone, right? It's because there's nothing to scroll, but it does appear as long as the keyboard is up. Cool. So that's really helpful from that perspective. So the last thing I need to do is set up a landscape layout for this, and then I think we're done with this example here. So note right now that we have two layouts, right? I have activity main, which is my portrait layout, and I have activity main scroll, which is that scroll view wrapped around the other layout. Now, when I create the layout variation, it does matter, the landscape variation does matter which one I start from, right? So if I start from the scroll view, that's going to create a variant of this activity main scroll. If I create a variant of activity main, that's going to create a variant of just activity main. So I'm going to go, I want to make sure that I'm in activity main here. As you can see, make sure that there's a constraint layout here at the top. I'm going to go ahead and change under this drop down. I'm going to say, let's create a landscape variation now. Okay, so I'm going to jump in here. I'm going to say, yes, I do want to add that to Git. And if we look over in layout, you'll see that there are three layouts now, right? So there is an activity main, which is portrait, activity main landscape, and there's also this activity main scroll, which contains the first two. So it's worth noting there that the variants are on activity main, not on activity main scroll. I only have one variant of that. Okay. So here, let's start laying this out as I had in my mockup. Let me bring my mockup back over and we can review that, right? So what I had planned, right, is the layout that we see here is the width and height are next to each other, and then the areas underneath, right? So there's just a slight bit of variation between this one and that one, and the calculate button is still up in the top right. Okay, so where I usually find it easiest to start when I'm starting with these, you'll notice it's important that I completely got everything working first before I even started building this landscape layout. Now that I've done all that, what I'm going to do first is I'm going to go ahead and delete all of the constraints. Right, so I'm going to take all of the constraints off of here. And actually, before I do that, let me switch over to the blueprint view so you can see the constraints that are there. Okay, so let's go ahead and delete all the constraints. All right, so there are no constraints on this layout anymore. I'm going to go ahead and add all of those constraints back in once I've kind of got them figured out about where I want those elements. So these elements, because they were previously, remember, match constraints, 0DP, when I removed those constraints, they all became fixed width. So like this one's 571, 667, 6067, and those were actually based also on the device I was previewing. So because I'm previewing on the Pixel, those are the fixed dimensions that it got. If I were previewing on, say, the Pixel XL4, I would have gotten different fixed dimensions. So that's one thing to watch out for. In fact, if I go to generic phones and tablets, the Nexus S, you'll see that things don't fit on the Nexus S anymore because of those fixed dimensions. Okay, so that's one thing to be very careful about, is that it's going to, once you remove those constraints, it's going to be setting fixed dimensions everywhere. So we're going to have to come back and fix that. All right, so back to Pixel for now, because that's where I started. I want to add my constraints. And actually, before I add my constraints, I'm going to go ahead and just set all of these back to wrap content as their width. There we go. So that's going to shrink these down and make it easier to work with here. So I want the label up here, the width input. I want to move my label over here. I want that input there. And then maybe grab these two and move them up. Okay, so I want it roughly like that. So now it's just a matter of adding my constraints. This one, it seems to have already added a constraint, so I'm going to remove that. I'm going to anchor the button to the top right because that's a node. I'm going to anchor the label maybe to there, 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 and there. Anchor this top. And it's worth noting, well, where do you anchor the left to? Well, maybe the best way to anchor the left would be to anchor it to the left of the input it goes with. Now, I might want to do the same thing here, right? Anchor the left of that. Now, you'll notice it moved over a little bit. That's because the margin is set as 8, so I just need to set that back to 0 to bring those left margins back in line. Okay, so by setting that, that's going to keep it to the left of there. Now I'm going to anchor that up, and similarly I'm going to anchor this to the bottom of the width input, anchor it to the left, anchor this to the bottom, and anchor it to the left. Okay, so I've got a starting point for some of these. Let me go ahead and see what we've got so far as the Nexus S is concerned. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and turn left. Boop. You might notice that there's a problem here, that the width and the height fields are on top of each other. The problem is that I haven't created really a horizontal constraint to limit where the height input and where the height label are horizontally. I've limited them vertically, but not horizontally. So this one, I've said, hey, the height is anchored to the top. This is anchored to that, and I've said the label is anchored to the input, because I really want typically the input to drive where the location of things are, where the location of the labels are. But I need to anchor this height input to be the end or after the width input to get the layout that I'm really going for. Right, to give them both an anchor, to give them a constraint for where they need to be horizontally. Okay, so that gets us mostly where we want. You might remember that typically I want to go ahead and stretch these things out to take up maybe more of the horizontal space where possible. So I'm going to go ahead and start adding some constraints to the right sides. So I'm going to add a constraint here, and I'm going to add a constraint here. If I can get it, nope. if I can get it to connect. Okay. You'll notice that both of those have centered out because of the constraints on both sides. So I'm going to go ahead and set both of those to 0 dp, match constraints, to stretch them both out. And again, you'll see they have gone out and they've stretched to the point where there's no margins. Okay, so I might want to go back and fix these one by one, give 8 and 8 on the left and right, and give 8 and 8 on the left and right there. Okay, so now what about these inputs? I would go to the inputs next rather than going to labels next. Because what I want to do is I want, again, the labels, their position really to be influenced by where the inputs are. So I'm going to select these two, and I want to actually stretch them out. So I'm going to go to, first, I'm going to create a horizontal chain. Okay. You might notice that as soon as I did that, that added a constraint that's hooking it to, like, the right ones being hooked up to the calculate button because there's a slight overlap there. I actually do want to instead hook this to the right-hand side, of the layout rather than that. You might notice that there's some overlap. So in order to avoid that overlap, I actually do want to hook the top of the height, the top of my input, to the bottom of the button, right? So we're going to say, hey, that has to be underneath the button. And I need to do a similar thing here. I need to say that the top of that should be anchored to the same where the height is. Okay, that's pretty good. So now that these are two aligned and they're aligned to the bottom. The other way I could have done this, and maybe should, is rather than hooking this there, I should probably hook that to the bottom of the button. There we go. Yeah, so these are both hooked. Both the width input and the height input are hooked so that they're underneath the calculate button. Okay, now to get them to stretch out, remember I added the chain already. I added a horizontal chain. I need to set their width to match constraint. Okay, now they're stretched out. You'll notice that the labels moved as I did that. Do that again. When I set that width to match constraint, because I've anchored those labels to be their left side is anchored to the left side of the wind input. Now, there's a little bit of an issue here because these labels are a little bit farther away from the inputs than I'd like them to be. And the problem there is they're hooked to the parent vertically instead of hooked to the inputs vertically. So I need to get rid of those top constraints, and I want to add a bottom constraint to link it down there, bottom constraint to link it there. So now the left and the bottom is connected to the input instead of the other way around. So that's going to get me kind of a nicer layout where things are, again, connected to those inputs instead of being necessarily connected to the parent more. Okay, there we go. So that's a great start, right? So let's go ahead and give this a try. Let's say 10, next, 20, go. All right, there we've got the area, right? We've got the area calculated. That's all fine. If I were to try this with nothing in there, you would see invalid height, invalid width. There we go. So we can see those sort of errors. Cool. So that's my landscape layout. And I think with that, we've really concluded all of the behavior that we're trying to go for, right? So we've got this nice behavior in terms of working with keyboard. We talked about a few different things that we needed to do there in terms of, hiding the keyboard when it's appropriate, handling the soft keys on the keyboard, so whether it be the next key, the done key, the go key, whatever, resizing the view using that manifest setting, so you adjust resize, as well as just working with scroll views and all those kind of things. So when I'm finished with this, I do want to go ahead and commit the work that I have so far. If I go under commit over here on the left, I can check these ones. I also need to make sure I check all these unversion files. So I'm going to check both of those. here and up there. And I'm going to type in a message. I'm going to say this is our rectangle calculator. Okay, so all those files are I'm going to commit them. Going to take a minute to go through. Going to kind of review all of those, looking for issues. It's more than likely going to still find some problems, so there's still some problems in my file, still some warnings. I'm going to go ahead and commit those, not review those at the moment. And I'm going to go up to the toolbar up here. I'm going to click this push key, the green up arrow next to Get. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and push all my changes. And done. All right. So this has been an intro to making apps with Android, and I will see you next time.